Today I'm going to read from Balanced Riding. This is a rather old book. It's written by a British woman named Pegotty Henriques. It's a way to find a correct seat. In chapter 6 she talks about the correct position at the halt. There is very little disagreement about the classically correct position of the rider while the horse is stationary. It is only when the horse is required to move that the arguments and disagreements begin. And I just love that because, you know, we talk about the ear, shoulder, hip, ankle alignment, and everybody agrees that that's the line that you want. The question is, how functional is that when the horse starts to move in the way that you've done it? So many people pull their shoulders back and try to sit up, and yes, they get that line, but when the horse moves, we discover that there's a fault in that perceived position. So let us first consider how the rider should look and feel without the inconvenience of the movements of the horse. The human being is at times dependent on his balance to maintain any position other than a recumbent one, meaning laying back. Sitting on a horse requires that the rider find the center of his gravity and therefore his balance. And as I always say, gravity is not discipline specific, so it doesn't matter what kind of saddle you have on your horse or what discipline you ride. You know, gravity is the law when it comes to riding, because when it takes over and we come off that horse, it can be quite painful. So that's what we want to avoid. Sitting on the horse requires that the rider find the center of his gravity and therefore his balance. The beginner's natural instinct is to cling like a monkey. The moment a rider clutches with his legs or hands, his whole body becomes tense, especially his back and seat muscles. This rigidity foils his ability to balance himself. So she's saying that, you know, if you stiffen when you're on the horse, then it's going to make your balance harder, and that's very true. And her example here is, consider standing on a bus that is moving and rocking about. If you hang on to something and allow your knees to stiffen, you will not only have a very uncomfortable journey, but you will also start to ache from the effort. And if you ever get the chance to ride on a tram or at the airport, a nice little test, make sure you got the bar near you, is to stand there but not hang on. Just have it there where you can grab it if you need it. You'll find that if you soften your knees, it's going to be way easier, and if you stiffen, way harder. So that's exactly what we're looking for in the riding position. You have to soften your knees to go with the motion of the horse. The minute you brace, you're going to be stiff. And that's what she's saying here. If instead you let your body absorb the movement through your knees, hips, and back, as though swaying in the wind, your passage will be far more comfortable and much less exhausting. This is a good moment to differentiate between the hip joint and the hip bone. Hooray! I'm so glad to see this in writing. Anybody who's taken my courses knows one of the first things I ask is, where are your hip joints? And most people point to where the belt sits on the top of the pelvis. And while that's our cultural definition of the hip, it's not our functional hip, which is the joint itself. And it's so critical that you know where that hip joint is, because that's what is going to let you absorb the motion of the horse easily. So she makes that distinction here, and it's rare to see that distinction made in writing. This is a good moment to differentiate between the hip joint and the hip bone. The bone, ilium, which is part of the pelvis, is where you place your hands if told to put them on your hips. The joint is at the top of your leg, where the femur goes into the socket in the pelvic girdle. I will not complicate matters further by using technical terms, but will merely say hip joint and hip bone. And I just kind of love how she's just simplified that. I am very particular with my students about making sure you know where the hip joint is. When sitting in the saddle, the rider must balance on his two seat bones. Though this is easily said, the smallest deviation to the front or back edge of the bones will cause loss of balance and failure to stay upright. And I would include in that the side-to-side edges, because your seat bones are not a thin line, they have width. You have an inside and outside edge, as well as what she's calling, front and back. First, the rider should settle himself in the lowest and deepest part of the saddle, with his legs hanging down limply. Then, raising his knees until his thighs are horizontal, he should attempt to sit absolutely upright, with his shoulders and ears in a precise line at right angles to the ground. And I love how she describes it, but I also know that our self-image is what we're going to think, oh, I've got that line, because we're used to our feeling of our body. But when an objective person looks at you, that might not be the case. So here's where your cell phone is super handy. When you think you're in that line, have somebody snap a picture, take a look, and see if it's true. Because, you know what that line is supposed to look like. And she has the pictures right here of being in alignment. And the one behind. So he should not slump in the saddle, nor strain to be too upright, but should conjure up the image of a puppet supported by a solitary string fastened to the center of the top of his head. And that takes us back to Sally Swift's string for finding that alignment. Be careful though, because if you pull the string too hard, it's going to make you tense again. So just a little bit. His back should feel like building blocks with each vertebrae balanced neatly on top, one to the next. And again, that goes back to Sally's building blocks. I think some of these things are quite familiar. I'm not sure if she ever read Pegotty Henriques, but we can certainly see that there are threads throughout all the different books that talk about position, because there's the one thing you can't escape, and that's gravity.